Hi everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm going to be following up my video breaking down the unit roster of the Haradrim Golden Lion clan in the Last Alliance Total War by instead focusing on a different faction, Mordor. If you're new here, the Last Alliance Total War is a mod for Total War Shogun 2, set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, being somewhat of a prequel timeline-wise to Total War Rise of Mordor, a mod for Total War Attila set in the Third Age instead. As of making this video, the mod is in development, being in the version 0.2.7 alpha. While they may be somewhat early in the mod's development, there's still a fair bit of content to see in the mod, with several factions and a small campaign being ready to play. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. Today's video, as I said, will be a faction breakdown, with me going over their history within both the books and films of Tolkien's universe of Mordor, before looking at the civilizations that inspired it in real life. After that, I'm going to look at the faction's units and break them down, covering their battlefield roles as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic it is. Now that you know what mod we're going to be looking at, and the video itself is going to cover, let's start by going over the general overview of today's faction, Mordor. Mordor is a region in the southeast of Middle-earth, bordering what would become the realm of Gondor to the west, and the tribes of Harad to the south, Mordor itself being mostly comprised of desert wastes and rocky plateaus, although its southern region is fertile, something necessary for the area given it fields the largest armies in Middle-earth. Surrounded by mountain ranges to the west and north, Mordor essentially serves as the main base of the second Dark Lord of Middle-earth, Sauron, being the place where he amasses his vast armies of orcs and other supporters for use against the free peoples of Middle-earth. Almost impossible to invade, Mordor was taken control of by Sauron after the fall of the first Dark Lord Morgoth, and was used in Sauron's wars of conquest in the Second Age against the elves, men, and dwarves of Middle-earth in various wars, Sauron generally being defeated but always rising up to cause more destruction. As of the time period that this mod is set, the forces of Mordor would invade the elven realms of the west only to be absolutely annihilated by the forces of Numenor, an incredibly powerful foe who Sauron would defeat via subterfuge and manipulation rather than war, building upon his destruction of the greatest realm of men ever to exist by fighting against its successor kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor in the War of the Last Alliance. At the end of this conflict, Sauron would be defeated and Mordor would be placed under the control of Gondor, although by the time of the War of the Ring at the end of the Third Age, Mordor would be back under the control of the Dark Lord and on the verge of conquering Middle-earth. In the films, Mordor in the Second Age is only shown in the prologue and flashbacks in which the War of the Last Alliance takes place, revealing how the elves and men of the West join their power to bring down the greatest threat of their time, Mordor in the Third Age being shown more prominently in the Lord of the Rings film trilogy. In terms of historical cultures who may have inspired the faction, I find the Ottoman Empire to be the most notable given the clear parallels between Gondor and Mordor and the Byzantine Empire and the Ottomans, the forces of Mordor being a rising power from an eastern arid region on the verge of conquering an ailing empire to the west and planning on making further great expansions to the west, something that sounds like the growth of the Ottoman Empire from the 14th to 17th centuries. With the history of the faction both in and out of the universe looked at, let's move on to the units themselves. Unlike Rise of Mordor, in which generals can sometimes be more elite units that can be used multiple times in one army, the generals in this mod are unique, with each faction generally only having 2 generals, although this one has the most with 4 potential general units. The first choice of general for Mordor are the Uruk bodyguards. Uruks are a subspecies of orc that are more resistant to the sun and are stronger and larger, being an all-around improvement. However, to my knowledge, Uruks were only developed late into the Third Age, being a midpoint between regular orcs and the advanced Uruk-hai, so you could say that this unit is somewhat anachronistic. Looking at the Uruks themselves, they're heavily armoured line infantry, each warrior in the unit having a helmet, some resembling salets of the 15th and 16th centuries, while others resemble skullcaps and chevaliers of the 10th to 12th centuries, some having plates attached to the rear to protect the neck. For body armour, they wear a variety of scale and mail hauberks, over which they wear either plate breastplates in conjunction with gorgets, or they have articulated breastplates, the gorgets being on top of their breastplates, which is very much not historical, being seen more and more commonly in pop culture depictions of armour. While mail being worn under plate is known, particularly by the Italians, even if it wasn't that common elsewhere due to weight issues and being kind of redundant, scale being worn underneath plate isn't something that I've heard of happening in history. Protecting their upper legs, they have basic folds attached to their harnesses with straps, their arms having spolders and articulated van braces, lacking gloves, while their lower legs are protected by articulated greaves and sabatons, the upper legs remaining somewhat vulnerable. Over their upper chest, the Uruks wear what looks to be bearskins, seemingly for comfort rather than as armour, something which was done historically. Overall, the plate components of the armour resemble the plate that was being used in the later 16th and early 17th centuries, being mass-produced and not being of as high a standard as the plate armor that came before, which makes sense, given that that tended to be tailored armor rather than standardized. Each Uruk has a shield which resembles a large heater shield but made completely of metal, something that wasn't done in history, given that such an item would be extremely heavy and a burden to bear both on and off the battlefields. These shields also seeing use in the Third Age by Uruks of Mordor, being a common sight in the roster of Mordor in Total War Rise of Mordor. Also, given how heavily armoured these Uruks are, shields seem superfluous given that by the time in history warriors began to wear whole suits of armour, shields were mostly discarded as they were unneeded, the body armour being enough to protect the wearer from most attacks and allowing them to wield two-handed weapons, given one hand was no longer restricted to carrying a shield. Instead, these troops carry 8 historical shields and wield a variety of one-handed swords, being a mix of cutlasses, hangers, messes, talwars and shamshears, many having blades for knuckle bows, which seems like a good way to accidentally harm a comrade, even if it would be devastating if you punch an enemy in the face with the knuckle bow. While the weapons look suitably orcish, they're weapons that are more suited to killing less armoured foes and aren't anywhere near as effective as the two-handed weapons that these troops could potentially use. Turning to the unit officer, he wears much the same equipment as his troops, except that he has far more fur around his neck and upper torso, his shield being the same as his men and his sword having a spiked hilt and knuckle bow, making for a brutal weapon. Overall, as a unit, the Uruk bodyguard make for a good cheap general who can put in fair service, being fairly alright in melee. However, compared to a lot of the more elite professional infantry found in other factions, the unit is outperformed. I'd say if you're looking for a budget general, these guys are an option, given that they can beat early game units pretty handily, but be cognizant that Mordor has better general options, which make this unit somewhat superfluous. Moving on from the rather lackluster Uruk bodyguard, we come to the Black Númenórean Guard, a people whose history requires some explaining. The Black Númenóreans are the Númenóreans descended from the colonies established by Númenor on the western coast of Middle-earth, these settlements coming to fall under the sway of the Dark Lord Sauron, as would Númenor itself before its destruction. Those who turned away from the light of the Valar and instead beginning to worship Morgoth, coming to be known as the Black Númenóreans. While the vast majority of Númenóreans died when their island sank beneath the waves, those in the southern colonies such as Umbar on the Haradrim coast came to support Sauron in the War of the Last Alliance, fighting against the faithful Númenóreans. At the end of the war, the Black Númenóreans would remain a threat into the Third Age, especially in its earlier period, although by the time of the War of the Ring, the blood of the Black Númenóreans had been almost entirely spent due to various wars and intermixing with the lesser peoples of Middle-earth, very few such as the Mount of Sauron being the representatives of their race, still after millennia considering themselves the true heirs of Númenor, rather than the descendants of the faithful, such as the realm of Gondor. This unit is obviously an example of the Black Númenóreans at their most powerful, when significant numbers of them served the Dark Lord, although always they were considered among his elite, evident by their role as a general. Looking at the warriors in the unit, they're very heavily armoured, having raised helmets that look like a cross between a sallet and a barbute, with their general shapes, as well as Corinthian and Roman helmets with their crests, in the universe looking a lot like the helmets utilised by other Númenóreans, as well as Gondorian line infantry and the Fountain Guards of the Third Age, the Lannister helmets from Game of Thrones also coming to mind. Overall, these helmets are very interesting for multiple reasons, some positive and others negative. Feathers used on helmets to make a crest was most definitely done historically, and in this case makes for a very striking appearance that's quite intimidating, the red meshing well with the aesthetic of Mordor. The gilding on the helmets is great, helping to show off their elevated status, gilded armour being seen quite prominently in history. The raised and rounded profile of the helmet makes it easier for blows to glance off it. The cutout around the mouth are easier breathing, being quite nice too. However, the oculi for the eyes are way too big, leaving the eyes especially really vulnerable, with the historical helmets that had opening for the eyes being very conservative, so as to lower the chances of weapon making it into that weak point. Another issue that I have is that the cheek guards are way too wide, leading to a helmet that seems oversized and excessively heavy from the looks of it. Taken together, it's a very striking helmet which, while I do have issues with it, is very cool. Turning to their bodies, they wear what I'm assuming is a long shirt with a rider split, over which they have a gilded cuirass that wouldn't look out of place in the 16th century, with folds and tassets over the rider split segment, protecting the upper legs even if the rider splits aren't necessary for infantry. The upper arms are protected by spolders, while the forearms are protected by plate vambraces, some of them gilded while some of the men use leather, mail or a mix of leather and mail gloves for their hands. To finish off their look, they occasionally have gilded plate greaves and segmented sabatons that look straight out of the 15th century, as well as a black cloak emblazoned with the symbol of Mordor on their backs. Overall, their armour combines the beauty and advancement of Númenor with the darker symbolism of Númenor's growing greed in the gilding of their armour, as well as the shadow and flame of Sauron. Due to being roughly equivalent to a man of arms or knight of the 15th century when it comes to armour, even if they are lacking mail to protect the gaps in their armour, these warriors don't use shields, instead relying on their armour for protection. Similar to the Uruk bodyguard, despite having the ability to use two-handed weapons like poleaxes, the Black Numenorian Guard instead use bastard swords, capable of being wielded in either one hand or two, being longer than an arming sword and coming into use in the 14th century. Weapons like bastard swords were more often seen in the hands of upper-class warriors, so it makes sense that the more elite of Sauron's forces would gravitate to such a weapon. Looking at these swords, in particular, they have a leather grip with a round pommel that seems to be inspired by far older blades, while the upward swept guard of the sword too seems reminiscent of the swords of the Migration period and early arming swords of the 11th and 12th centuries. Turning to the unit officer, he is equipped identically to his men except that he has a striking red cloak to differentiate himself. As a unit, these guys make for high-quality line infantry who can fight toe-to-toe with the professional infantry of other factions and win, unlike the Uruk bodyguards who will struggle. The Black Numenorians having the edge due to their better stats in all departments, being loyal to Sauron out of their worship of him rather than fear, making them very reliable and difficult to break. While they can't quite handle cavalry similar to most infantry units, as a general I consider them a major step up from the Uruk bodyguard at only a very slight price increase, one which I consider well worth it. I believe that if you want a general, this unit will always provide satisfactory service, in a way making the Uruk bodyguard obsolete for the most part, a great unit overall, not just in appearance but in prowess on the battlefield as well. Moving on from the Black Numenorian Guard, we come to the sole cavalry general unit that Mordor can field, the Nazgul leading the Black Riders Guard. Riding unarmoured horses, every man in the unit is equipped identically to the previous unit, so I won't go over their equipment and will instead look at the unit officer, who is a Nazgul, one of the 9 ring wraiths of Sauron. A Nazgul serving as a general makes a lot of sense given that they were among Sauron's most prized servants, but also because they came into being during the Second Age, the period this mod is set. Added to that, we know that at least some of the Nazgul were Numenorian lords, so it makes sense that a shadow of a Numenorian would lead a unit of his kin into battle. The Nazgul itself wears only black robes and gloves, foregoing any armour, the robes giving the entity shape and form. The Nazgul lacks a shield given they're practically indestructible, and for a weapon wields a bastard sword that looks more advanced than those used by its men, having a flatter crosspiece and a more elongated pommel reminiscent of later designs. As a unit, the Black Riders Guard are the most mobile general that the Mordor faction has access to, and is the heaviest hitting of all units, having great stats all across the board, and while the unit isn't shock cavalry and is instead melee cavalry, it can still do tremendous damage in its charges, obliterating enemies with ease, its usefulness being reflected in its price, which is more than most generals in the mod, let alone the faction. A great unit and one that I very much recommend bringing to the battlefield, as it gives the faction much needed mobility that Mordor is lacking due to its lack of cavalry, even if the unit is vulnerable to pikemen and spearmen. However, as expensive as the Nazgul may seem, there's still another general unit that outclasses it in price and stats apart from charge bonuses, and that is Anatar leading the Barad-dûr Guard. Anatar is the fair elven form that Sauron takes in the Second Age, as a way of working his way into the confidences of the elves and men of the West, disguising his true identity and using anonymity to collect information on his enemies and to manipulate them into their doom, a strategy he uses successfully against Celebrimbor and his elves, as well as the men of Numenor. However, Sauron loses this form after the destruction of Numenor, and is instead forced to take on forms that more accurately reveal his evil self. Looking at the unit itself, every man in it is a Black Numenorian equipped the same as the previous units, so we'll move on to the officer, Sauron himself. Sauron lacks a helmet, something which isn't a good idea, as while not wearing a helmet means that you're more identifiable to your troops, it also means that your enemy can identify you easily too and target you. Personally, I'd say the protection of a helmet trumps any morale boost that your men seeing you might give, but that's just my opinion. For armour, Sauron wears a mail hauberk with a rider's split for some reason, over which he wears a highly decorated breastplate which looks to be of elven design, most likely reflecting the fake bonds that he built with the elves during his time as the gift giver among them before his duplicity was revealed. Attached to the breastplate to provide extra protection for his legs are tassets and folds, the armour looking like pieces made in the 16th century. One thing to note is that the mail underneath all this plate is somewhat superfluous, as the plate provides necessary protection, the mail only really being useful in the gaps that plate naturally can't protect. Over his mail-covered sleeves, Sauron has spolders and what appears to be scalloped vambraces, his lower legs being protected by plate greaves, the Dark Lord wearing leather boots rather than the sabatons of his men. Finally, on his back, Sauron wears a bright red cape to differentiate him from his troops. Lacking a shield, Sauron uses a massive metal mace as his weapon. While maces were most definitely used in combat, maces that massive were not, especially when made completely of metal, given that a weapon of such size and material would be impossible to wield by anyone less strong than a troll, although given that Sauron is an angelic being in the form of an elf at this point, it is possible that he could use this weapon in battle. If so, it'd be devastating, capable of brushing aside any opposition. Sauron's taste for ludicrously oversized weapons also being shared by the Witch King of Angmar in the films with his enormous flail. One thing to note is that on Sauron's left hand, he bears a golden ring, the Ring of Power whose creation will be the cause of millennia of conflict and millions of lost lives, its existence kicking off the War of Sauron and the Elves, which would eventually lead to the destruction of Numenor and the War of the Last Alliance. Overall, looking at Sauron's armour, it's quite a lot nicer looking than the jagged armour he would wear in his Dark Lord form. This mace, while being similar to the mace he's shown using later, being a bit more sanitized, made of gleaming metal rather than black steel, cutting a nice balance point between revealing the dark heart of Anatar and the performance he puts on as he plans his conquest of Middle-earth. As a unit, the Barad-dûr Guard are by far the most expensive unit fielded by Mordor, and probably in the mod as a whole. However, the supreme stats of the unit mean that it's next to unbreakable and can punch through most enemy units with relative ease. Funnily enough, I wouldn't recommend using this unit as your general, despite all its great features, because at the end of the day, I feel that the other generals fulfill their role at a cheaper price point effectively, this unit being a win more unit at best. It's definitely cool, but unless you've got a lot of money to spare when building an army, I wouldn't recommend picking this unit, as awesome as commanding Sauron himself is. With Anatar's unit covered, all of the generals of Mordor have been looked at, so we'll continue looking at their roster, beginning with the first of two units in their spear line, the Snaga Spearmen. These orcs are the lowest of the low, Snagas being the slave caste of orcs, and these troops' equipment reflect it, the orcs almost completely lacking armour, wearing patchwork tunics except for a helmet that resembles a Cervelier or skullcap, giving them some head protection at least. That actually makes a lot of sense and is something I like to see, given that the first bit of armour any soldier would pick up would be a helmet, given how useful they are, body armour only coming into consideration after that. The orcs utilise square wooden shields similar to bucklers emblazoned with the red eye of Sauron, the shields being strengthened with metal bands, although the shields don't look very useful at all, given these orcs' lack of equipment. For weapons, the orcs use barbed spears that more resemble fishing spears than battle implements. As the unit lacks an officer will jump straight into their role, that being of rabble of the lowest quality, being vulnerable to everything on the battlefield and having no redeeming factors apart from their large unit size. A very early pickup for Mordor's army. The only use this unit has is absorbing enemy punishment so your better units can engage unscathed, essentially being a meat shield and in swarming enemy units, this only really being a useful tactic against low level units. As such, I recommend ditching these guys as quickly as possible and moving on to the next unit in the Mordor roster, the Orc Spearmen. A clear step up from the previous unit, these troops are all armoured, wearing a variety of helmets seen being used by the Orc bodyguard, so I won't go into detail on these Orcs' helmets. For body armour, they wear a long mail or scale shirt over their tunics, having spolders to protect their upper arms, appearing to have steel-shod shoes to protect their feet. Unlike the Snaga Spearmen, and much like the Desert Spearmen of the Haradrim factions, these warriors lack shields, using their armour to protect them from enemy attacks. While discarding shields to rely on armour was done, it was most prominent in heavy troops in the 15th and 16th centuries, wearing plate head to toe, who could afford not to have shields, troops such as these being better served with shields than without. For weapons, they use bardishes rather than spears, an odd choice for spearmen, although these weapons would be far more useful when both arms are free, such as these orcs are, the weapon's blades making them perfect for hacking down enemy infantry and cavalry, while the sharp tip makes it useful for fending off marauding horsemen, such weapons seeing common use in the hands of lower class troops. Looking at the unit officer, is equipped the same as the troops in the Uruk bodyguard, the only difference being that instead of a sword, he wields a bardiche like his warriors in combination with the steel Uruk shield. As a unit, these troops are fairly weak given that they are orcs. However, they easily outclass the previous unit and can take up spear war formation, meaning that they can form a line of defense that can somewhat hold against low to medium units, although professional troops will beat these guys handily, archers being a menace to watch out for when deploying them. Personally, I'd recommend not using them as the core of your army, and instead using them in reserve to ward off horsemen, massed armies of sword infantry being the true strength of the faction. Overall, a lackluster unit, but one that does fulfill a role and is the best anti-cavalry unit the faction can field, which says a lot about the quality of the orcs on the battlefield. Moving on from the orc spear line, we come to the first sword infantry unit the faction can field, the Orc Band. Equipped just as lightly as the Snaga Spearmen, these troops wear only their clothing into battle as well as the helmets that we've seen before. They use a variety of shields, some being wooden bucklers with or without central bosses, almost all having rimming in some shape or another. some having cutouts while others lack them. In addition to these shields, others use what are essentially rectangular Roman scutum made of wood rimmed with metal bosses. Such shields being not only used by Roman legionaries, but some of the lightly equipped tribal warriors they faced off against in Hispania. For weapons, they mostly use short swords, some resembling shamshears and others butcher's knives, none having guards. The unit officer is identical to the previous one, so we'll jump into their role. On the battlefield, these warriors are the early building blocks of Mordor's armies, being somewhat more useful than the Snarger spearmen due to their more offensive nature. However, the gap between both units isn't much at all, these orcs being used much the same way to absorb enemy fire and tire out enemy units before the big hitters come into play. I recommend massing them up for early game armies or for armies in which you're limited with money, but switching them out for better units is something that should be done the moment it's possible. This unit also being the epitome of the word fodder, everything in the game slaughtering it. A step in the right direction, the Orc War Band supersede the Orc Band. These troops essentially being the Orc Spearmen but with the shields and sword of the Orc Band, meaning I'm not going to go into detail on their armour nor their officer, who's what we've seen before. While still very much a unit that's outclassed by the competition for the most part, these warriors are useful to some degree, utilising numbers to bring about victory, even if they are vulnerable to every type of unit. These orcs being the core of Mordor's mid-tier armies, belying just how much Mordor relies on numbers rather than quality to win. A unit that can be dangerous when massed in large numbers. Such a strategy is the best way to use these warriors, swamping enemy units until they break. Overall, a unit that encapsulates the Mordor playstyle and which is somewhat useful, even if only in large numbers. Progressing on to the next unit in the Mordor roster, we have the pinnacle of the faction sword infantry, the Uruk War Band. Equipped almost identically to the Uruk bodyguard general unit, the main thing that sets these troops apart is their lack of bearskins as well as their weaponry, having a mix of swords and maces, some of the maces being boar maces and others being more rectangular, all having spikes but to different degrees, some being absolutely festooned while others are a bit more conservative. All these weapons looking like they'd fit perfectly in a museum collection. Against heavily armoured enemies, these maces are the perfect choice of weapon, bypassing the armour while also reflecting the brutal side of orcs. Skipping the unit officer, who's much of what we've seen before, these are the most professional sword infantry that Mordor can field, and will be the bulk of your army in high tier builds and late game armies. While not quite an equal match for the elite infantry of factions like Numenor or the Elves, the unit does well against lesser troops and very much boosts the efficiency of Mordor's armies, even if they're found to be lacking when facing off against cavalry. A unit that in my opinion is crucial to victory for any potential Mordor players, I suggest massing these units and using them as an armoured fist to sweep the field of enemies. As the Uruk Warband are the last sword infantry unit the faction fields, we'll start looking at the Mordor axe infantry beginning with the Orc Raiders. Equipped almost identically to the Orc Warband and Orc Spearmen, these troops are differentiated by the additional plate armour over their mail and scale shirts, the round plates bringing to mind those used in classical Italy by the warring Italian city-states and tribes such as the Samnites, as well as the Roman Kingdom and early Roman Republic. Others wear square or rectangular plates, which were also used during the 13th and 14th centuries, when the transition between mail and plate began, armourers and warriors experimenting with different combos. Lacking shields, these warriors used bardishas, shorter than those used by the Orc Spearmen with a nasty spike on the bottom of the shaft for killing incapacitated foes, the weapons looking like those used by the Russian Streltsy of the 16th century. Skipping the standard unit officer who wields a bardish, these guys are your basic shock infantry, outputting a fair amount of damage and having reflective stats for a mid-tier orc unit, being useful at hacking down stuck cavalry and being devastating against enemy infantry when attacking them on the flanks, even if the unit is vulnerable to shock cavalry and archers. My suggestion is to recruit a fair amount of these warriors so as to use them as a reserve in battle, breaching holes in enemy lines, being very useful in sieges where they can help break clusters of enemy resistance. That said, the Mordor roster has an extensive line of axe infantry, and these are the least it can field, so making them a core component of your army isn't the best idea in the long run, as they are outperformed by other units, such as the Orc Executioners. These orcs are essentially the same unit, except that they have plate van braces as well as greaves. Skipping the officer, these troops are a step up in almost every stat department, just being slightly more expensive but making up for that with their elevated combat prowess. While I said that the Orc Raiders have a role in your armies, these guys perform that role but far better, which is why the moment you get access to them, I suggest replacing the Orc Raiders with the Orc Executioners, the unit just having better lasting power on the battlefield, although it is important to note that for an Orc unit it's fairly small, which means that each Orc lost is worth more and makes overwhelming enemies with numbers more difficult. Luckily for Mordor players, they have a unit that lacks those issues, the Uruk Stormband, who share much the same equipment but these warriors have pauldrons, spolders, and sabatons now as a unit standard, giving them that much more protection. Skipping the officer, as a unit these troops are effectively very similar to the orc executioners, except that the unit is almost double the size, meaning that swarming enemies is that much easier, a strategy that very much plays to Mordor's strengths. For their price, the unit gives you fair performance, which leads me to suggest recruiting them in large numbers if an offensive-oriented army at a fair price is what you want, such a force being very useful when storming enemy fortifications. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Uruk Berserkers of Lithlad, who as their name suggests come from the Lithlad region of Mordor. Armour-wise, these troops are kitted out the same as the previous unit, but with added plate, cuirasses and gorgets, the gorgets being over the top of the cuirass, a historical inaccuracy that won't ever fail to irk me. The helmets worn look like a cross between a German pickelhaube of the early First World War with a top spike, but made entirely of metal, crossed with an armet and a Phrygian helmet. Similar brutish helmets being seen used by orcs in Total War Rise of Mordor, as well as Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War. Overall, a very well protected head for these orcs. Skipping the officer, these are the peak of the orc axe infantry you can recruit, excelling on the offensive and tearing holes through enemy formations with ease, being a clear choice for high tier and late game armies. I recommend recruiting them in large numbers if you have the finances to support them. Otherwise, just use them as an additional bit of muscle in combination with the Uruk Storm Band. However, while I said that these troops are the best orc axes you can recruit, they're not the best axe infantry overall, given that the Mordor roster has access to one more unit of axemen, the Black Númenórean axemen. Outfitted the same as the other Black Númenórean units, these troops use beautiful axes that remind me somewhat of the two-handed Dane axes used by some Nordic warriors as well as Anglo-Saxon Huskarls. While the weapons are based more on implements used during the 11th century compared to the 16th century equipment of the warriors, large two-handed weapons are perfect for such heavily armoured infantry, so there is logic in them using such a weapon, even if a poleaxe would be a better choice of weapon. Skipping the standard red-cloaked Black Númenórean officer, these troops are the best axemen in the roster, their heritage as men rather than orcs playing a role in that, as it makes them far hardier and more difficult to break than the lesser troops in the roster, having the best armour by far of any troops and allowing them to absolutely tear through enemies, including the highest tier units possible. Weak only against shock cavalry and archers to a limited degree, these troops are a prerequisite if you're building the most elite, heaviest hitting army that you can when playing Mordor, the unit giving the faction quality of the highest degree. An absolutely amazing unit, the Black Númenórean Axemen are the last melee infantry unit that Mordor has, so we'll move on to their ranged units, beginning with the least of their kind, the Snaga Javelinmen. These orc slaves are equipped much the same as the Snaga Spearmen, lacking armour entirely, using javelins as their main weapon, while in case of melee they use a variety of short blades, some having clipped ends and others lacking them, resembling butcher knives and shrunk down falchions, their shields being rectangular rather than bucklers like the other shields used by Snaga units. As the unit lacks an officer, we'll jump into its role on the battlefield. For early game armies, this unit will be a prerequisite, as it gives you a lot of range support extremely cheap. However, the unit is abysmal when it comes to absorbing exchanges of enemy barrages and surviving, only their numbers being really useful in such a situation, whereas in melee these troops stand no chance against anything, barely having a use even when attacking enemy units from the rear unopposed. That said, with their javelins, these troops can be quite nasty depending on their positioning, especially when letting loose into enemy backs. Unfortunately, because they are skirmishers, they're outranged by archers, meaning that they have to take punishment before they can deal it out, meaning the unit is likely to break before it deploys its javelins, although given how cheap the unit is, it's not that much of a loss. Overall, an incredibly crappy unit that is for a while necessary, but once better options become available, it should be ditched in a heartbeat. Moving on from the Snaga Javelinmen, we have the first archer unit available to Mordor, the Orc Archers. Equipped practically the same as the Orc Spearmen and Orc Warband, some of these troops use a helmet that resembles a cross between a Spanish morion and a kettle helmet, both helmets being used more notably by lower class troops, and in the case of the kettle helmet, archers especially. For bows, they use recurve bows with metal blades attached for some reason, or for melee they have short swords at their side. The recurve bow makes sense in the hands of an orc, given that recurve bows are compact, which fits well with the smaller size of orcs in comparison to men or elves. Skipping the officer, these orcs will be the heart of your ranged power in the early to mid game, not being an even match for equivalent archers in other factions and generally being quite fragile, but when used en masse, these weaknesses aren't quite as prominent, at the very least the unit being capable of fighting archers without being massively outranged like the previous unit. Very much a lackluster unit, at the very least the orc archers have a designated role in your armies, something that can't be said of every unit in the Mordor roster. Moving on from the orc archers, we come to their superiors, the Uruk archers. These troops are equipped identically to the Orc executioners when it comes to armour, wielding the same recurve bow as the previous unit and having blades that resemble cutlasses and heavy-bladed sabres at their side, perfect for use in the crush of battle. Skipping their bow-wielding officer, in battle these Uruks are a massive upgrade from the Orc archers, having roughly double their stats, just making for an all-around hardier unit that is capable of seeing service in melee as well as in range of battle. Although in melee this unit is better served attacking enemy flanks and rears rather than being the core of your infantry line, being more than capable of putting rabble to flight. As a unit, these archers will make up the bulk of your range power from the mid to late game, and while they are outclassed by other factions' elite archers, they still make Mordor that much more lethal on the battlefield. A good unit overall, even if they are outshone by the next unit, the Black Númenórean warriors. The Númenóreans have a culture that highly values archers, so it makes sense that the Númenóreans in service to the Dark Lord would provide him with elite archers, these troops most definitely classifying as elite. While they're kitted out the same as the other Black Númenórean units, these warriors have quivers, arming swords at their sides, and large bucklers rimmed with metal emblazoned with the symbols of the Eye of Sauron combined with the seafaring symbols of Númenor, such as seagull wings, this being the only Black Númenórean unit to use shields in combination with their armour. Bucklers were commonly used by archers such as the famous English longbowmen, but such troops tended to be lightly armoured, these warriors instead being covered in armour head to toe, making shields a bit superfluous. However, the main thing that sets these troops apart is their key weapon, the Númenórean steel bow, one of the most advanced bits of technology developed by the Númenóreans, allowing them to use hollow metal bows practically as powerful as those used by the elves with the same range. This technology giving Númenórean troops a clear advantage over almost any force they'd be expected to fight, such as the Haradrim and the Orcs, this technology being lost in the Third Age, forcing the successor kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor to fall back to using wooden longbows. As far as I know, the only metal bows used in history are the sporting bows used currently, although I may be wrong, so if I am, let me know in the comments. Skipping the officer, in battle these warriors have incredible range, allowing Mordor to rain death on the enemy before they can return fire, the armour being of such high quality that they can absorb enemy range attacks to a very high degree. This armour combined with their skill in hand-to-hand combat means that in melee, these troops perform better than a lot of the better Orc units, meaning that they can serve in the front line fairly well, even if they are vulnerable to shock cavalry, essentially transforming them into a hybrid heavy archer sword infantry unit of the highest caliber. I'd recommend getting as many of these archers as possible for late game and high tier armies, even if amassing them proves to be difficult. Just having a few among your Uruk archers will make your armies that much more powerful. I'd recruit these guys every day of the week, their existence finally giving Mordor a unit that can counter equivalent units in the Númenor roster, as well as the elite archers fielded by the elves. With the Black Númenórean warriors covered, all of Mordor's infantry, be they melee or ranged, have been looked at, so let's move on to the final category of soldiers that the faction can field, mounted troops. The reason why I say mounted troops rather than cavalry is because Mordor actually has no true cavalry apart from the Nazgul, instead using mounted wargs such as the Uruk Warg riders. Wargs are massive sentient wolves that are known for being creatures of evil in Middle-earth, allowing themselves to be ridden by orcs so as to combine and increase the carnage that the two species can cause. Looking at the Uruk Warg riders, all of the wargs are unarmoured, the riders being outfitted almost identically to the orc executioners except for their mix of round and rectangular shields, using a variety of swords seen in other units, their profiles being perfect for running down fleeing infantry much like cavalry sabres. As it seems the unit lacks an officer, we'll move on to its role, these troops serving for all intents and purposes as your cavalry, more fulfilling the role of melee cavalry. In that role, they're useful at pinning down stuck cavalry and tearing through archers or attacking units from behind, although spearmen pose just as much of a threat to them as they do to horsemen, while archers can be a menace due to the lack of armour on the wargs. Definitely a useful unit that gives Mordor mobility that it was critically lacking. These guys should be recruited more or less to support your armies, rather than be the core hitting power of your forces, enhancing your plays more than being the core of them. Moving up from them, we have the last unit Mordor can field, the Uruk Warg Riders of Lithlad. The riders of these unarmoured wargs wearing much the same body armour as the previous unit, as well as swords and shields, differentiated by wearing a mix of helmets such as those used by the Uruk Berserkers of Lithlad, some of the riders having the visor attached to their helmet, and others just using the metal pickelhaube for head protection. The unit officer is distinguished only by his bearskin worn over his armour, so we'll move on to their role. On the battlefield, these troops are the more aggressive version of the Uruk Warg Riders, putting out more damage but having less armour as is reflected in their stats. This means that the unit is marginally better when used defensively to attack enemy formations, rather than defensively to fend off enemy cavalry, although it can fulfill that role, just not quite to the degree that the Uruk Warg riders can. A powerful unit, these warriors give Mordor additional mobility and make massed armies of Warg somewhat of a potential strategy, although I'd say it's more effective against lesser foes and enemies of equal strength. Again, this unit's best use being to extend your strategies in a way that only mounted troops can. Overall, a good unit and a nice way to cap off the Mordor roster. Looking at the faction overall, Mordor is very much a faction that relies on quantity rather than quality to assure victory, sword and shock infantry being the key hitting power of the faction, although the more elite units that can be fielded do definitely bring quite a lot of quality to the table. Hordes of infantry are generally the way to go when playing this faction, and while it may seem a fairly basic strategy, it's one that's just as useful on the open battlefield as well as in sieges. With a high concentration of shock infantry Mordor can field, make taking fortifications a far easier prospect compared to lighter factions like the Haradrim. That said, the Warg units give Mordor some flexibility, overall leading to a faction that has a definite preferred playstyle but can change up its game plan. With all that said, it's time to wrap up this video, so if you've enjoyed, please make sure to like and subscribe. It may not seem like much, but it truly means a lot to such a small channel. If you want to watch similar videos, check out the rest of my channel and rest assured that in the future, I intend to make more videos on this mod as well as Total War Rise of Mordor. So if you want to see such content, stick around. This is your host Jakov, signing out.